In the autumn of 1944, outside a shattered German village near Aachen, a Wehrmacht marksman settled his cheek against the stock of a Karabiner 98K. He was not guessing. He had learned his trade in places where mistakes did not get corrected. Russia, Ukraine. The long retreats through mud, snow, smoke, and hunger. He had survived because he could shoot. His rifle was the kind of weapon old armies trusted. A beautifully made Mauser bolt action, precise, simple, strong enough to be dragged through rain and rubble and still put a bullet exactly where a trained man wanted it. Across the road, American infantry began to move between a smashed orchard wall and the shell of a barn. The German chose the first man. He breathed out, fired. Then came the motion every rifleman in Europe knew by heart. Lift the bolt, pull it back, drive it forward, lock it down. That tiny break was less than a second. But war can live inside less than a second. Before his sights settled again, the Americans answered. Not one rifle, not two. A hard, overlapping rush of shots came back at him, so close together it sounded less like a patrol firing and more like a machine waking up. The German ducked into the cold wall. He had fired one careful round. They had answered with a sheet of aimed fire, and somewhere inside that storm came a small, bright, metallic sound. A ping. Then more shots. Always more shots. That was the part that made no sense. He was the better rifleman. He knew it. He had years of war behind him. And most of the men in front of him had months. But the half-second his rifle demanded from him. Their rifles did not demand at all. An ocean away, in a government armory above the Connecticut River, that half-second had already been studied, measured, machined, and removed. Not by a famous general, not by a battlefield hero. By a quiet French-Canadian immigrant named John Garand, a toolmaker who understood steel better than speeches, and who would never earn a royalty from the weapon that made his name permanent. His rifle did something armies had argued about for decades. It let the ordinary infantryman fire a full-powered rifle round, reload itself, keep his hand on the trigger, and fire again. Again. The Germans had built their infantry around the expert and the machine gun. America built a rifle that made the average man dangerous before he ever became an expert. And by 1944, German soldiers were learning the terrible truth in orchards, hedgerows, villages, woods, and streets across Europe. The better shot could still lose, because America had filled the pause between shots with a factory. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what almost everyone else was still carrying. When the Second World War opened, the standard infantry rifle of the great armies looked modern only from a distance. Germany had the Karabiner 98K, Britain had the Lee Enfield, the Soviet Union had the Mosin Nagant, Japan had the Arisaka. Each rifle had its virtues. Some were rugged, some were fast, some were very accurate in trained hands, but nearly all of them obeyed the same old rule. After every shot, the soldier had to stop firing and work the bolt, not think about it, not decide whether to do it. He had to do it. His hand left the firing grip. His sight picture broke. The empty case came out. A new cartridge went in. The bolt locked. Then, and only then, could the rifle become a weapon again. A good man could make that sequence look almost graceful. A great man could make it look fast, but nobody could make it disappear. Military experts accepted this because they believed the alternative would create worse problems. A self-loading rifle sounded attractive on paper, but paper did not have mud in it. Paper did not have frozen springs, fouled gas ports, bent parts, frightened recruits, or ammunition wagons stuck 10 miles behind the front. The doubters had arguments, and some of those arguments were reasonable. A semi-automatic rifle would be more complicated. It would be more expensive. It might encourage soldiers to waste ammunition. It might jam at the worst moment. And even if a country could make a few good ones, no one believed it could make enough of them to arm an entire mass army. So the safe answer was the old answer. Train the rifleman, trust the bolt, make every shot count. Germany followed that logic with one brutal adjustment. The German infantry squad was built around the machine gun. First the MG-34, then the faster and more terrifying MG-42. The riflemen were important, but their most important job was often to support that gun, protect that gun, feed ammunition to that gun, and let that gun dominate the fight. Take the machine gun away, and much of the squad fell back into the older rhythm. One man, one bolt, one shot at a time. America went a different way, and the strange thing is that the man who took America there did not look like the kind of man who overturns infantry doctrine. John Garand was born in Quebec in 1888 and came to New England as a boy. His family was poor. His schooling was short. His education came from mills, machine shops, and the patient logic of metal. He worked around tools before he worked around rifles. That mattered, because the problem was never simply how to design a clever weapon. The world had clever weapons. The problem was how to design a rifle that could be made over and over again by the millions, with parts that fit, with tolerances factories could hold, and with a mechanism ordinary soldiers could trust after crawling through dirt. Garand understood that kind of problem. He knew that a part did not only have to move, it had to be cut, measured, hardened, inspected, replaced, and made again tomorrow by someone who was not a genius. At Springfield Armory after the First World War, he began wrestling with the rifle other men said was too difficult. The answer he built used the power of the fired cartridge itself. When the rifle fired, a portion of the gas drove a system that unlocked the action, pushed it rearward, ejected the empty case, chambered the next round, and cocked the weapon again. All of it happened faster than the soldier could work a bolt. All of it happened while his firing hand stayed where it belonged. 1936, the United States adopted Garand's rifle as the M1. Officially, it was the United States rifle, caliber .30 M1. To the men who carried it, it became simply the Garand. It fired the powerful .36 cartridge. It fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip. When the 8th round was gone, the empty clip jumped out with that sharp, unforgettable ping. It was not a toy. It was not a light carbine for show. It was a full-power battle rifle, built to put real force downrange, and then do it again before the enemy had finished moving his hand. That was the engineering victory. The industrial victory was larger. Springfield Armory in Winchester turned the M1 from a brilliant design into an American habit. Receivers were milled, barrels were rifled, stocks were shaped, bolts were cut, operating rods were formed. Gauges checked what human eyes could not afford to miss. By the time American troops were fighting across Europe and the Pacific, millions of M1 rifles had been built. Not a special issue for hand-picked units, not a rare prize for experts, not an experimental advantage reserved for a few lucky men. The standard rifle. That was the radical part. America did not merely invent a better weapon, it normalized it. It put the self-loading rifle into the hands of farm boys from Nebraska, shipping clerks from New Jersey, mechanics from Alabama, college students, dock workers, sons of miners, sons of immigrants, men who might never have fired a rifle before basic training. And it gave each of them something the old armies had treated as a specialist advantage. Speed. Not wild speed, not panic fire, aimed speed. The ability to shoot, correct, shoot again, and keep pressure on a target without breaking the whole motion of combat. The difference on paper can sound small until you imagine it under fire. A trained bolt-action rifleman might fire 10 to 15 aimed rounds in a minute if he was working hard and keeping control. An infantryman with an M1 could often produce several times that rate of aimed fire because the rifle was doing the slowest part of the job for him. One man became harder to rush. 2 men became harder to pin down. A squad became something different. Now multiply it. 12 men, a platoon, a company, a battalion. Multiply every missing bolt stroke. Multiply every moment when a German rifleman was cycling his action and an American rifleman was still firing. Multiply the pressure on every hedge, cellar window, ridgeline, ditch, tree line, and roadblock. That is where the weapon stopped being a weapon and became a system. The Garand did not make every American a sniper. It did something more useful. It made every average rifleman a source of continuous, disciplined danger, and the enemy felt it. German soldiers often believed they were being hit by more automatic weapons than the Americans actually had. The impression made sense. A line of men with M1 rifles could sound and feel like more than a line of ordinary riflemen. The fire came too quickly, the gaps were too short. The answer arrived before the bolt-action mind expected it. It was not magic, it was arithmetic. And in battle, arithmetic has a way of becoming terror. The famous ping became part of that terror too, although not always in the way legend tells it. The story is that German and Japanese soldiers learned to listen for the sound of the empty clip, because the ping meant the American rifle was empty. Then, supposedly, they would rush the shooter, and American soldiers, learning the trick, would toss an empty clip against a rock or a helmet to make the sound on purpose, drawing the enemy out into fire. Historians still argue over how often that really happened. In a firefight full of rifles, machine guns, artillery shouting, and men trying to stay alive, hearing one small clip clearly enough to act on it was not always realistic. But the legend survived because it expressed something true. The enemy was listening to the American rifle. They were trying to find a gap. They were trying to locate the one moment when the machine stopped giving the American soldier his advantage. The irony was that the old rifle had a gap after every shot. The Garand had one after 8, and even then the American had usually bought enough time to reload. German engineers were not fools. They understood the direction of the future. They tried to get there. Germany produced the Gewehr 41, then the improved Gewehr 43, and late in the war it fielded the Sturmgewehr 44. A revolutionary assault rifle whose influence would outlive the Reich that built it. But timing is a weapon too. The German self-loading rifles arrived late, struggled in numbers, and never transformed the average German infantryman the way the M1 had transformed the American one. The Sturmgewehr was brilliant. It was also a late answer from a country being bombed, starved of materials and forced to solve tomorrow's war while losing today's. America had made its decision earlier. That was the difference. By the time Germany was trying to catch up, the American rifle was already in crates, on ships, in training camps, in landing craft, in foxholes. In the hands of millions, the idea had become supply. Supply had become habit. Habit had become battlefield reality. And that reality did not stay theoretical for long. An American rifle company did not need every man to be the best shot in the valley. It needed enough men with enough ammunition, enough spare parts, enough clips, enough rifles, and enough production behind them to keep the pressure constant. That was the American way of war at its most devastating. Not romance, not duels, not the lonely expert deciding the field by perfect skill. A connected chain, designer, gauge, factory worker, rail yard, ship depot, truck quartermaster, armorer, rifleman. The German marksman at the wall was facing all of them. He could see only the patrol in front of him. He could not see Springfield Armory. He could not see Winchester. He could not see the inspectors rejecting bad parts, or the women and men on factory floors feeding the machines, or the crates moving toward ports, or the ships crossing the Atlantic, or the replacement rifle waiting for the next soldier if the first one was lost. But every time an American fired again without touching a bolt, all of that unseen machinery was present. The factory was in the road with him. The factory was in the orchard. The factory was inside the half-second he had always counted on. That is why General George Patton's famous praise of the M1 still echoes. He called it, in his judgment, the greatest battle implement ever devised. Patton loved speed, pressure, movement, and offensive force. The Garand fit that mind perfectly. It turned motion into rifle fire. It gave the advancing soldier a way to keep the enemy's head down while he crossed the dangerous space between cover. It made defense more stubborn and attack more violent. It did not win the war alone. No rifle ever does. But it changed the infantryman's share of the war. And for the men on the wrong end of it, that was enough. The saddest part of the story is that the man who solved the problem did not become rich from solving it. John Garand was a government employee. The patents connected to his work belonged to the United States. He received his salary. He received respect. He received eventually the kind of public praise that sounds large until you compare it to what he had given away. But he did not receive royalties on the millions of rifles made from his design. A bill was introduced in Congress to award him $100,000 in recognition. It did not become law. So the man whose rifle helped arm the largest American army ever fielded retired on an ordinary government pension. He kept tinkering. He kept working with his hands. He died in 1974, known to soldiers, collectors, historians, and armorers, but never rewarded in proportion to the force he had placed into history. There is something almost American about that too. A country that could turn genius into a production schedule. A government armory that could take one man's patient mechanism and multiply it until it changed the sound of war. A weapon famous enough to be praised by generals, carried by millions, feared by enemies, and remembered by a single metallic ping. And behind it, a man who did not own the legend he created. Back near Aachen, or in Normandy, or in the Hurtgen Forest, or on any of the roads where American infantry met German veterans in 1944, the same brutal lesson repeated itself. The German rifleman might be calmer, he might be older. He might know how to judge distance by eye and wind by instinct. He might have a rifle as accurate as any soldier could ask for. But the fight no longer belonged only to the better marksman. It belonged to the army that could decide which seconds mattered, then build a weapon to take those seconds away from the other side. The bolt-action rifle had ruled because it trusted the man to create speed by skill. The M1 Garand changed the equation. It made speed part of the equipment. It made pressure part of the standard issue. It put industrial power directly into the soldier's hands, and then sent him forward with 7 more men, carrying the same answer. That is why the German veteran pressed himself into the dirt when the American patrol fired back. Not because he was a coward, because he understood in that instant that courage and skill were being answered by something larger than courage and skill. He had brought a rifle to a gunfight. America had brought the factory, and the factory had filled the half-second.